Welcome to Full PreFrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive functions. This show is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. These conversations will introduce mental tools that will empower you to shift your mindset for a successful life. And now, here's your host, Sucheta Kamath.
All right, welcome back to Full PreFrontal, where we are exposing the mysteries of executive function. I am here again with our host, Sucheta Kamath. Good morning, Sucheta, my friend. Always good to be with you. Very much looking forward to your second conversation with Dr. Carol Westby. But before we go there, you're going to talk to us about the famed television character Michael Scott and the grand dame actress Bernadette Peters.
Earlier this year, Todd, I went to see Hello, Dolly when Bernadette Peters debuted in the role of Dolly. And needless to say, the celebrated Broadway star was spectacular in it. And I, was reading through the playbill and something caught my eye because there is a Broadway critic, Michael Riddle, who wrote that Bernadette Peters is as good as Bette Midler in Hello, Dolly. Now, that was very strikingly positive and directly complimentary, which is not what Mr. Riddle is known to do in his reviews. He's quite critical and always seems to stir the pot. And what was so interesting about that there was an article online, which, of course, I began to read. And Michael Riddle, had ridiculed Miss Peters in her performance in Gypsy a year earlier. And he received a lot of flack for that. And of course, a lot of feathers were ruffled and a lot of hearts were hurt because of his nasty comments. So in this article about, this debut performance, he had written in third person. So I'm going to read part of that article so you'll get a glimpse of that. So he says, at the end of this article that he wrote, I have no idea where the columnist is today, although every now and then I catch a glimpse of him in the mirror. But should he materialize, I hope Peters can find it in her heart to forgive him and invite him to her opening on February 22nd. So the reason I'm telling you this story is that Michael Riddle was saying it like it is, and he didn't use any veil to curtail his feelings about Miss Bernadette Peters' performance, which he thought it was substandard. And he said it like it is, which led to her feelings getting hurt. And then she's performing in a new show and he thinks she's done well. So now he has to get in her good graces. So he writes this article about himself in third person so that she reads and gets a chuckle out of it. And he hopes that she will change her mind. So this whole banter that's going on in this article tells how Michael Riddle is reading minds of Bernadette Peters and hoping that he will get a different response for the actions that were not so favorable, which he did earlier. So that brings me to this whole long-winded explanation that I just did, that have you ever seen The Office, where Michael Scott, the show Office? Have you, Todd?
Well, I'm absolutely familiar with it, yes.
And if you haven't seen, you should take a minute to watch maybe 3-4 episodes. And I promise you'll be horrified by Michael Scott's behavior. So the protagonist, Michael Scott, is immature, impulsive, easily distracted. He's constantly bustling with crazy new ideas. He's often off topic, not even sure of what he's saying or doing sometimes. He talks a lot. He doesn't listen. He explains the obvious. He interrupts people a lot and loses interest in things and people. His leadership is quite often driven by pursuit of shiny ideas, and he pursues them with sudden urgencies and childlike persistence and stubbornness. But what is painful to watch is his decision-making. You think as a leader, he's the office manager, he would be, the sailing would be smooth, but it's not. He gets stuck. He hates to settle in on one idea, and most often he stalls and stalls and stalls. The last and the most important part that is relevant to this podcast, I'm coming to the point, I promise, is it's really, really painful to watch Michael Scott's social skills. He is terrible at social forecasting. And he is honestly, if you ask me, and I'll diagnose him with having mind blindness. He cannot see himself through the eyes of others. He can't imagine what people think of him. He doesn't even have a clue how unfavorably people think of his behaviors and impulsivity and immaturity. He has very optimistic view, which really comes from a place when you are mind blind. So I'm trying and connecting these two scenarios that I just described, Michael Rydell in real life, trying to beg to get back in positive favors with Bernadette Peters and Michael Scott, who's constantly oblivious and never trying to get on positive side of anybody because he thinks he's just perfect and everything is great. And of course, Michael Scott is fictitious. But I just want to talk about in today's session with our guest, how people with mind blindness get in trouble and what should we do with them. So that brings me to our guest today, Dr. Carol Westby, who's returning to our show for the second episode, where she's going to discuss with us what is theory of mind, what components of theory of mind that we need to support and kind of prop when we are dealing with children and adolescents and adults with impairment. She's a speech and language pathologist, a celebrated one, and she is an educational consultant and my personal favorite expert in theory of mind and social communication disorders. I've seen her speak several times. She has done tons and tons of workshops nationally and internationally on topics such as theory of mind, play, language literacy, development, and disabilities, and most importantly, multicultural issues. She is a recipient of numerous awards. One particularly worth mentioning is the Honors of the Association Award from American Speech and Hearing Association. So here we go. This is Carol Westby.
Well, I'm looking forward to the conversation, Sucheta. I think one of the reasons that the show The Office and the character of Michael Scott was so popular for so long is I think it's a very common character in most people's business lives, and they can relate to it, unfortunately. So now I understand that there's a different way we can think about the character of Michael Scott. So it's going to be fascinating. So let's get right to it. Looking forward to it. Here is Sucheta's conversation, her second conversation with Dr. Carol Westby.
Welcome back, Carol. I'm so happy to continue our conversation about theory of mind, reading the minds of others, understanding the internal states of others, and using that knowledge to predict how people are going to behave, predict the way people will react, and adjust your own behaviors, thought processes, and impulses so that there is a harmony in interactions. So my first question is, can you give us some framework as to what goes into designing effective intervention when we are trying to promote the development of theory of mind skills?
Well, we've talked about the essentially 5 dimensions of theory of mind. So I want to be aware of where the person is in each of those dimensions. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? So assessing, can they think about other people's thoughts? Can they think about their own thoughts? Can they reflect and interpret other people's feelings and their own? So that becomes important. Cognitive theory of mind is quite dependent on language skills. And so that's why if an individual has a language impairment for any reason, there will be delays in theory of mind. It's why for so long, children who were deaf children of hearing parents had marked delays in theory of mind as severe as children on the autism spectrum. They've gotten better now with implants. Children's speech and language has improved markedly, and they're passing some of the early cognitive theory of mind at the same time as hearing children. There are ongoing delays, however, if we look at higher levels of theory of mind. So you need to know where the child's language is. And for cognitive, we're going to be working a lot on the language piece. The affective theory of mind is coming in from the moment of birth in those attuned interactions. By 7 to 8 months, the typical child follows eye gaze and already has assumptions as to why you're looking at things. This is an area where...
Carol, can you take a minute and explain a little bit about attunement and how the visual component also, the eye gaze is an important part of attunement. Can you talk a little bit about that?
If you watch that parent with the newborn, and they're gazing into each other's eyes. The parent starts vocalizing, the baby's watching, and even within those first several days, the baby will start imitating the facial movements of the parent. If the parent opens her mouth, sticks out her tongue, you see the baby kind of trying that, and the mom will be watching. And those attuned interactions are where you realize the baby and the caregiver are really in sync. You need those kinds of experiences also then to develop a good affective theory of mind. That's the beginning. In those first couple months, Stephen Gutstein talks about this as emotional sharing, and he talks about is the absolute foundation of all theory of mind. If there's not that emotional sharing, all of the higher levels of theory of mind do not develop. So babies are watching, and gradually then, as the caregiver looks away, by 7 or 8 months, babies follow that gaze. And not only do they follow it, they begin expecting something, or they already begin. It's kind of hard because we can't really say they're thinking, but they seem to be aware someone is turning their head because they're looking at something. Now, this is something that can be deficient even in older kids, particularly those on the spectrum, even though they might not have severe cognitive delays. There are some individuals on the spectrum, can be older preschoolers, can even be in elementary school. They don't realize that someone knows something by looking at something. They don't know to follow someone's gaze. Turns out this is also very delayed in kids who have hearing loss. We have to often explicitly teach it to older preschool children with significant hearing loss. Look at what someone's looking at. So that becomes very important foundation for all theory.
Can you give us an example just so that people can visualize this? Such an important process.
Well, particularly, let's say, what will happen? Let's say we're sitting at the table and the doorbell rings. Here's why individuals with hearing loss don't learn following gaze. A lot of times our gaze goes to something because we've heard something. So we get up and we go to the door. And one of my friends whose daughter was deaf said she was like a teenager where she always wondered how her mother would know to go to the door and open it when someone was there. Mom would get up and she wasn't aware of what was happening, didn't kind of follow eye gaze, and that mom was hearing something that gave her information. And so we'll find that a lot, that kids, if they don't hear the sound, they also don't make the connection why someone's looking away and what information they're getting. So it disrupts that learning and disrupts learning those visual cues that are going to be important for the affective piece.
And, I see that in the ADHD children that I work with, that if the teacher looks at the students and she stops teaching and she's looking at one student who, let's say, is fidgeting or is not, or he's tearing pieces of paper and making a paper ball, and she wants him to stop. So she's stopping her teaching to model what is not acceptable. And the ADHD kid has back to the student that the teacher is looking at. So he may not be following or may not be emotionally able to share because he's not really looking at where the teacher is looking.
Right.
And then he does the same thing and joins the other kid making the paper ball.
Right. So that gaze following that comes very early can often be quite delayed. Most kids will eventually get it, but there are some, even in elementary school or beyond. And then you have to really, by 8 to 12 months, kids are doing what we call referencing. It's that joint attention. I'm looking at this cookie. I know you're looking at the cookie. You know I'm looking at the cookie. But the typical 8 and 12-month-old also starts thinking, you're going to grab my cookie. They start thinking about what you're thinking about. They're referencing. They're reading your emotionality. There's a great clip on YouTube of a toddler and the examiner showing him some toys, and another woman comes in and the examiner's holding up this necklace, and the other woman says, "Oh, that's just really annoying. It's such an annoying toy and it makes that noise and I just really don't like it." And you watch the baby look at that expression. The examiner then hands the baby the toy. He will not touch it. He looks at the woman who had complained. He looks at the evaluator. He moves away from it. There is no way he is going anywhere near that toy. He has read her affect. He has interpreted it. He's not going to get in trouble. 8 to 12-month-old babies are doing that. That's where you can have adults on the spectrum that can't. We had one adolescent, very bright youngster with Asperger's. And one day his student clinician comes in, and this is at Brigham Young University, and the youngster is really into the sports teams, and he's got, his blue and white BYU sweatshirt on. His student clinician comes in, and she has on her red and white University of Utah shirt. He melts down. He's just really upset. And then he says to her, "You can't let anyone see you on campus. They will beat you up." And she said, "No, they're not." For his whole session, they took him walking around campus, stopping people, talking. "See, he's looking at you and he's going, no, he is not going to hit me. I grant you shouldn't wear a red and white University of Utah shirt on the campus, but no one is angry at me. No one is threatening me." He didn't know how to look at the faces, how to interpret it. He had this preconceived idea that people are going to be really angry at you, and that's what he was going to see. And so they had to work really explicitly looking at the clues. He couldn't look at faces and interpret the information. Typically developing babies are getting that. And that often then is a major area of deficit throughout the lives of many people who are on the spectrum, real difficulty.
So when you say spectrum, you're talking about autism spectrum. And you're saying that this is one of the ways the worldview becomes very narrow. And this also leads to a lot of rigidity and also kind of limits the way they are able to form relationships to anybody who looks different or has different ways of thinking or different ways of being, in fact, right?
Well, things they don't know what to look at, what aspects of the face, the body to look at. We have to explicitly teach that, what to look at and what does it mean. It's interesting, individuals with severe hearing loss have problems like that, but for different reasons. Even if they have really good amplification systems, hearing aids, implants, they have to work so hard at hearing. It takes up a lot of working memory space. So it's then more difficult for them to attend to all of the clues that signal emotionality. And so the research on individuals with hearing loss shows they have ongoing deficits, particularly in cognitive affective theory of mind. People always knew they were at risk for cognitive theory of mind deficits because of the language. You have to hear words like think, know, and remember. So they're getting better at that because their language skills are getting better. But they will always be people with hearing loss. And it makes it more difficult for them to pick up all of the social cues. So there were 2 studies in the last 2 years looking at cognitive affective and found that even deaf adults are not as good at it. And it's not necessarily so bad that you say they're pathological, but they're not as good at it. They miss cues. So in social situations, sometimes things go awry because they don't get all of the cues.
Got it. So now that we understand so many components go into even designing interventions, so can you share some of these? So you're obviously saying that if it's a cognitive deficit, then building some inferential and language extrapolation skills will be really helpful to kind of expand that theory of mind. Can you kind of share the therapeutic process?
So, even starting with the young kids in therapy and parents using those mental state words. I'm thinking. Kids can't see you thinking and knowing. So using those words a lot. I'm thinking, I'm knowing. One of the activities, we have a cute clip of this, a little boy with bilateral cochlear implants, and he would not yet pass that false belief task that someone knows, I know something someone else doesn't know. He's getting close. And so we've brought him in, and the teacher's showing him a book. And we're going, I read this book with someone else. Now, you and I, we're going to make this slime. And does Jordan know what you're going to do? I saw Jordan before, and I read this book with Jordan. Jordan's not in the room, and you and I are going to make this slime. Does Jordan know? Yeah, Jordan knows. Now, Jordan's not in the room. He can't see what we have in front of us. Does he know? Yeah, he did it too. No, I told you, we read the book, and we're going, and so the teacher said, Jordan wasn't in here. He's not in here now. He's back in the room. He can't see you. Jordan doesn't know what you're going to do with me. Very explicitly talking about knowing and thinking and modeling that. So we do a lot of that. We do, and certainly a lot with books. And here, building both the language for the cognitive and affective theory of mind. The linguist, the Villiers, said some time ago had shown that there's a strong relationship between being able to comprehend and use what we call verbal complements in theory of mind. And a verbal complement is that nominal clause, I think, and then we have a whole sentence that's the object of that verb think. I think we'll go swimming today because it's really hot. Okay? That's a complex syntactic structure. And they found that as kids, even typical kids, were able to master that. Then they start also being able to master cognitive theory of mind, because it requires that kind of language structure. So we'll explicitly teach that. We'll read storybooks, and we might have, we like some of Jan Thomas's books that have a lot of affective theory of mind in them. They're little stories about animals, but the emotions are very clear. But then we help build the language. Cow felt thrilled when he got the turnip because it's his favorite food. So kids are seeing the picture. Cow's having a birthday. We would think he'd be happy with the cake. But it turns out Cow doesn't like cake. His friends thought Cow liked cake, but Cow didn't like cake. His friends didn't know that Cow liked turnips. So as we're going through even these preschool books, making it very explicit, modeling those complex syntactic patterns where you have that whole verbal complement. Mouse thought Cow will like a chocolate cake. Pig was sure Cow wanted ice cream. Okay? So kids hear that structure. So we do a tremendous amount with that. With the little ones, with the older kids, though, we do it the same thing. We'll watch the adventure movie with the teenagers, tune them in. How is Loki feeling? How do we know? What do we see in his face? What do we hear in his voice? What is he thinking? What is he feeling? But now build a sentence. Loki was ashamed of what he did because he had let down his friends. So we, even with our adolescents, working very explicitly, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? Making the inference. Now, how do we verbalize this? So that's a lot of our intervention across the whole age range.
So, in terms of education, and if these children are in the classroom, however, they have, I shouldn't say not diagnosed, but they have not received any specific intervention, they can become really difficult to manage. That
Yes.
can create a challenge for the classroom teacher because you're not getting cooperation. You have very concrete learners and thinkers in the classroom
Right.
who don't seem to be understand a purpose of an activity, or even sometimes teachers, or we all say, just go with me, just bear with me for a second while I set up the stage for whatever I'm about to do. And a lot of these children need explicit understanding before they will have a buy-in. And eventually, I work with a lot of adolescent adults and older adults, and they are suffering from similar challenges. So what kind of interventions you see seem to work for older who may not be receiving any formal training like this?
But there
Or
you're
early on.
saying, at some point, there needs to be explicit teaching about this. Without very explicit learning, what are the cues I have to look at? How do I talk about this? A big piece of it is that many educators don't know those things are missing. Just yesterday, this a good example, a youngster really quite verbal at one level, real severe behavioral problems going on. And they were reading a book about Mr. Happy and Miss Grimm. And have you ever been sad? Yeah, I'm sad. What makes you sad? No one at school likes me. We say this to the teacher, and the teacher said, he's always punching other kids and he doesn't get it. I say, of course, they're not going to like you because you punch them. But I'm saying, and watching other things, and I'm saying, he can't read the cues. He's not aware of how upset other kids get. The teachers are trying to say, you made him really feel bad. No, he does not have that clue. And as we did further interviewing and talking, this is one of those children that does not appear to have affective empathy. Often even a young child, if they hit another child and that child starts crying, they'll back off. There are some youngsters, and we don't fully understand always why this is, but they do not have that spontaneous affective empathy. And so even if they hurt someone and that person's really upset, they don't read the cues. All this child was reading now, you're not playing with me. It's like, no, he's crying because you hurt him. He's really hurting. If he's hurting, he's not going to. And you realize that youngster is missing all of that. Very difficult to know how to help develop that affective empathy. It's an area of active research. We don't have real good strategies. We can develop the cognitive affective empathy better. But there again, and that's what a lot of the social programs do. Help the person learn, what do you have to attend to? Now, a comment along these lines, people are talking about autism as context blindness. In order to really get good at theory of mind, you have to simultaneously integrate many different cues. So you have to be looking at that person. What's the body language? What's the facial expression? What's the tone of voice? We find many of our kids don't realize, they don't differentiate between a pleasant voice and an angry voice. So the teacher thinks she's made it clear, you will now stop this. And she said,
it doesn't work.
No, it doesn't work. She could have said, oh, we're having so much fun here. I think we'll keep going.
Exactly.
They not read the tone. And then that upsets the teacher because all the rest of the kids have. So you have to teach them all those cues. But then what are all of the other cues? In certain situations, you can do certain things. And in another situation, you can't. What room are you in? Who else is there? Is the principal here? Typically, developing kids know not to misbehave when the principal is around. Principal's not there, then even typical kids often will. I've seen situations though where the principal comes into the classroom and the kid that doesn't have theory of mind keeps doing what he's doing. And everyone,
Exactly.
it's like they have been perfect angels the whole time. They don't know why the principal's come down. But that does not get it. Principal shows up, the environment has just changed. So teaching them to read all of the social clues, all of the environmental clues, the building you're in, the weather, what are all of the factors that could impact what someone else is thinking and feeling? That's why it's a lifelong task for a lot of individuals.
It really is. And I think you hit the nail on the head by talking about this working memory component, to manage, to theorize what people are feeling, thinking, predict their actions, and gauge their response to what you're about to do or what you will never do requires a song and dance. And then this idea of I know, I know, and then I know, and then, incorporating that into how much should I tell? How much do you already know? How much is gossip? What is good gossip, bad gossip? A lot of these people are not able to play the game when they become older. They are not able to kind of get promotions. They are likely to get divorced more frequently, and they're also likely to be rejected from peers' point of view because they're just not in the game, so to speak. Or lastly, I would say I always call when I do this training, I always call it social endorsement value. How much are you bringing to the table that you're endorsing the status of other individual who's hanging out with you?
Interesting. Yeah.
And if you're not, if you're not, then you're likely to become a burden rather than an asset. And that's why people will stay away from you if you're not adding any value to how they are perceived by others. So theorizing what others think when they are with you. So
reference to the working memory is so critical here. For typically developing individuals, some of this gets automatic. For individuals, even individuals with language impairment, a lot of it stays explicit, and that takes more working memory. And so they don't have, their working memory is so taken up with all of these different tasks that it then adds to the component of exhaustion and attention issues, because they're having to work so much harder to figure out what's going on and what should I do and how should I behave. You can't keep that up for 8 hours a day. So that's another factor that plays into this.
Yeah, and the last part of that working memory component is it works well when everything is going per plan or there's no interruption or any roadblocks. Then you add the roadblocks, then your emotions are flaring, then even further bottleneck effect, and you don't have access to all the space in the brain to compare, evaluate, and then take better decisions, or not at least take poor decisions. But I see that also become compromised with not just fatigue, but also emotional tempers flared. So,
and as soon as that emotionality arises, that's taking up part of the working memory space that's not free for processing the information.
Yes, absolutely. Well, this has been a phenomenal discussion. Any parting words that you feel we should consider when we are thinking about, or the parents and teachers can think about, who are not really delivering any formal therapy, but they are part of this village where these children and young adolescents and adults are operating?
I would encourage people to do more thinking aloud, particularly educators. They do a little bit of that with younger kids, but really modeling how they problem solve, what they're thinking, why they're thinking and feeling this way. You can only learn a lot of that by hearing and seeing other people doing it. And so a lot of the individuals we work with need that done much more explicitly, So that would be a major encouragement, particularly, is to have teachers do that. Think aloud themselves. That's another strategy. We use the think aloud strategies a lot with students.
Well, fantastic. And I think I can see this being used in a marriage. And then that can also be very effective. Well, Carol, you have been a tremendous speaker, and your knowledge is incredibly, first of all, exciting for me. I could listen to you for hours, and what you have managed to cover in such a short period of time is incredibly valuable. So I thank you so much for being on this podcast and sharing these ideas that people can begin to implement. And I will connect a lot of resources that you have mentioned in the podcast so people can look through them. So I truly thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity. I always like talking about these ideas.
All right, and we're back. And as I suspected, another wonderful conversation, Sucheta, with Dr. Carol Westby. As usual from your conversations, I learned a lot. Any initial thoughts you want to share about the conversation?
Of course. Thank you, Todd. Wasn't that a great conversation? I think the most important thing here is focus needs to be on this idea of emotional development in children. And there are a couple of few important milestones that parents need to be aware of, which is, as Carol was talking about, is eye gaze following, which is looking where the other people's eyes are looking, and referencing, which is together looking at the same thing. And this preliminaries, I'm calling them preliminary, but they're emerging very, very early on signs of emotional maturity and theory of mind, because we are theorizing what people are looking at, what people are going to do based on what they see. What do they think about what they see? And so when we have these kinds of developmental milestones in place, babies then begin to develop foundational skills that help them climb the ladder of emotional sharing. And emotional sharing is the primary root that strengthens the sense of self in the social world. And as I mentioned earlier in my introduction, that we are born to socialize. We are here to make connections, and our ability to make connections, if at all ever hindered, that can create a lot of problems in the future progress or trajectory of our life as an adult. So that's why this is such an important aspect of social emotional development.
Well, listening to the conversation, I now understand that training theory of mind skills is possible. Can you shed more light on that process, please?
Sure. There's no point talking about a particular aspect without really talking about what do we do if that ability is absent. And that's where Carol's work has focused on. Training to build strong theory of mind skills needs a focus on specific aspect of explicit teaching. That should involve talking about it, modeling it, and then revisiting that new learning again and again until it is cemented in terms of an idea and then also an inculcated behavior. So in order to do that, language is such an important component of developing theory of mind. And she was talking about in passing, I hope the listeners were able to catch on to, is the complex syntactic structure in the linguistic aspect of communication is really important in child's ability to actually refer to these distinct processes, that what is my understanding of my thinking and what is my understanding of your thinking, my understanding of my feelings and my understanding of your feelings. So every training must incorporate this process of looking for clues that signal emotionality, which means we need to help children develop this ability to know what to look for and make sure that those clues are picked up on and then the right appropriate meaning is formulated. So if somebody is making a face, you need to first be paying attention to the face. What if you have a child who's so distracted that he's playing with a toy and he's not looking at the face? So a child grabs a toy from somebody and looks away from the face at the toy. He has missed out on inferring or making conclusions about what that action has meant to that child from whom you grabbed the car or the toy from. So noticing is really, really important, which requires strong attention skills. And then second is making inferences about what the meaning is. And then finally doing something differently so that you can change the other person's emotional state, is what Carol is talking about in terms of training. And the second important part is that high a level of information overload, which causes people to really drown in information and not really keep up with it. And the second part of that information overload is not having a catalog that kind of tabulates information and its corresponding inference. So this face means somebody's upset. This means is they're peeved. This means they are frustrated. But this means they're disgruntled. So if you don't have a repertoire that connects a face to an emotion, you're going to think that somebody's mad. And I often in my practice, and Carol also talked about this, that we often see children say, "Are you mad? Are you mad? Are you mad?" There are no shades of emotional, texture to the way they interpret other people's mental states. And lastly, I think she said training should really, really incorporate peppering that interaction with communication with language that suggests the inner workings of theory of mind, which is using phrases like, "I am thinking this, I am feeling this." So labeling your own emotions can really help also in training the theory of mind skills.
So let's talk about this practice of daily management. So how should teachers and parents address daily management?
Oh, nothing but explicit teaching. And we cannot emphasize, I think that's the point Carol was making. This is the point I also emphasize in my conversations. One of the things that I often talk about is really, really you need to stop talking. So when you stop talking, you get the engagement of your child, the child who is listening without eyes. Are you using your eyes to listen or are you listening with your ears? So it's possible to listen without really looking. And that is one of the reasons why a lot of information about somebody's inner state is lost. So teaching children, and they may be your adult children, at at a dinner table, that they're not looking because they're looking at their phones and they're saying, So making sure that there is certain engagement where, the explicit teaching of how to engage with eyes when you're listening. Second thing is to really kind of understand a variety of ways to recognize why somebody doesn't like me. Somebody doesn't like me. I often hear students complaining or teachers talking about students who complain and say, "Nobody likes me. He doesn't like me. Nobody wants to play with me. They won't include me. I'm the last one to get picked to be on a project or a team. You're not playing with me." So when you see this, what you are hearing the child say, that I don't understand what's going on in your head that makes me not really think about your head, but I'm so much in my head that I am lost. So this is where teachers can really focus on, is getting the child to start, making extrapolations about what's going on in other people's thinking. And lastly, I think what she was talking about, which can be a very helpful tool for teachers and parents to manage, is thinking out loud. This is a chance for a teacher or a parent to demonstrate what he or she is thinking and feeling, and then how the decision was made based on what he or she was feeling and thinking. And that, when made transparent, can become a great, great propelling force for a child to have a better self-management at the end of the day.
Lots of great things to think about here. Before we go, Sucheta, any final thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, so Todd, I think we offline have had a lot of conversations about, effective people. So if you talk about leaders of the country, we talk about bosses in workplace, we talk about colleagues that we work with, we talk about mother-in-laws or, spouses even. Anytime we have friction, that friction is one party failing to understand the needs of the other party, but that could be coming from two places. I know what you're thinking and feeling, but I don't feel motivated to do anything about it. Or I don't know what you're feeling and thinking, and that's why I'm lost. So we will temporarily leave this first category aside, that intentionally we are excluding or ignoring what the other person is feeling and thinking because it leads to more vulnerability. But from my discussion here about theory of mind is many, many people are at a loss in not knowing how to navigate the social world because they're ill-equipped, or they have very poor inferences to be made by understanding the inner lives of other people. So I would love for people to slow down, pause a little bit. If something is not clear, to put out their inferences about other persons. Is this what you mean? How are you feeling? You're saying you're feeling this way, but I'm not sure because I see something else.
that kind of conversation can really promote and prompt others to open up with you, and that can give you the advantage that you're looking for.
Two great conversations with Dr. Carol Westby on theory of mind. Fascinating stuff. Unfortunately, it's all the time we have for today. On behalf of our host, Sucheta Kamath, and all of us at Cerebral Matters, thank you for listening and tuning in today. We look forward to seeing you again right here next week on Full PreFrontal.
Thank you for listening to Full PreFrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive functions. To contact our host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive functions, visit her website at cerebralmatters.com. That's cerebralmatters.com. Tune in next week for the next informative episode of Full PreFrontal.